My name is Nelson Parker. I'm a social worker in private practice, and I'm also a professor here at University of Guelph-humber.
Perfect. So I know that you did a presentation a few years ago at the National Eating Disorders Information Center. So I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the stuff that you talked about
Sure.
there. If you had anything that you want to say freehand, if not, I have some questions that we might be able to help the discussion.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about the that conference. There was some momentum to begin to look at eating disorders and eating issues as they impacted men. So I, at the time, was working at a counseling program for gay men. I was contacted to see what was this kind of an issue happening in the community for gay men. Was I seeing a lot of people with eating disorders as an issue? I had known sort of anecdotally about some people, but I hadn't worked directly with people who had sort of what people would traditionally think of as like an anorexia or a bulimia. But certainly kind of moving out from that into issues of body image and body dysmorphia, there was a lot of evidence of that. And so I said that what I could feel comfortable presenting on was kind of the issue of body image, particularly as it had impacted gay men, and where and I took a somewhat historical perspective, not going back too far, but to reflect on sort of images and body image as it had been in sort of the 50s, 60s, 70s.
What were some of the patterns that you had found?
I think sort of the most interesting thing was that there had always been a kind of an idealization of a male physique, and that went back like quite far. That there'd been like male pictorial magazines, and they were always framed as being for bodybuilding, but clearly they had like an erotic element for people, and those images had always been present, and that was kind of in a contradiction to what a typical image of what a gay man would be. And really the most significant trend started to shift as gay liberation occurred, and then there came to be more visual images of real true gay men, that physical ideals of like hypermuscular kind of bodies and images were idealized. And then there was the impact of HIV and AIDS, and so then people became, particularly in the early years of the AIDS crisis, people were getting sick. They were young and getting sick. They were losing their looks. They were losing their physical control, their physical self in many ways, and so there became an ideal of not looking ill. So it was very important to look healthy because that meant you didn't have HIV. And then there was a real movement towards working out, muscularity, muscles, and size were a really defining pattern.
So then what issues then do men face with regards to body image and aesthetics that can trouble them to that point?
I think that there's been, as issues around gender are sort of evolving and changing, so are some of these trends around how men see their bodies. So I think that the sort of the most obvious thing is like people talk about metrosexuals and this idea that all of a sudden men became much more interested in how they looked, how they groomed themselves, what their physique looked like, idealization of certain kind of bodies, and if you think about like comic books, action figures, all those kind of things present male physique in a very specific way of what is ideal. Then I think men started to become aware of those things, and some men started to feel the need to sometimes control eating and follow. There is some evidence. I certainly have seen. There's an interesting documentary. I can't remember the title of it, on eating disorders for gay men. And so there clearly were some people who were presenting with a traditional kind of experience of eating disorders, but there also was a lot more body dysmorphia and pressure to do things like steroids. I think men in general, that's become, it's interesting, I just came from working out at the gym at Guelph-humber, and there was clearly a young man whose back was covered in acne, who was very big, and it's obvious to me is doing a lot of steroids. And there was a lot of young guys around him talking and really interested in what he had to say, and you know, it seems to me that's they're all responding to some kind of pressure about what it is they're supposed to look like.
So would you say that that gentleman at the gym just now is being admired for?
Oh, definitely, definitely.
Okay. So do you think that obviously men and females, or males and females, we all experience different types of pressures. Do you think that the pressures that a straight man would experience would be different than what a gay man would experience?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that some of the trends in the gay community might be that there is more of a pressure around an expectation of physical beauty or staying young, and an idealization of staying young and fit, and that that may be less so in the heterosexual community, and I think that that has to do with gender and like how men see their sexual partners and what they expect from that. So, I mean, that's why it's a much more common trend to have an older man and a younger woman. We're seeing some of the reverse of that, but it's a much more common trend to have an older man, and that it doesn't matter that the man isn't as young or as beautiful as the woman. So I think that occurs. I'm sure it occurs in both worlds, but I think that there's a little bit more of that likely to occur in the heterosexual.
Okay. What's your perspective on inspiration? Have you ever heard of it before?
Inspiration, no.
Basically, there are a few blogs out there, websites that are like pro anorexia or pro eating disorders, and they have a bunch of thin images of thin people or videos of thin people, or like tracking down how much weight they've lost, and they're doing it obviously in an unhealthy way. So what's your own opinion on something like that that's so easily accessible to so many different people?
Well, I think it's very scary. It can, okay, it's sort of two things to me. It's scary and it's confusing. It's scary because it's so pervasive. It's confusing because we know so much now about body image and how women are represented in the media, and how how photographic images in magazines and things like that influence people, and yet it doesn't seem to have any effect. Like, models are still rail thin. If you look, it's interesting too, if you look at male models now, there's a movement for them to be that kind of tall, rail thin, whereas it used to be more to be muscular, and now they're developing that same long, angular, thin kind of view image, and it's so pervasive. So it's confusing to me that we know that is not helpful, and yet it still continues to be perpetuated. And so then, as soon as any female celebrity has a baby, it's immediately discussed how much weight has she lost, how much weight is she, how quickly did she lose it, how did she lose it. It's the obsession doesn't seem to be shifting at all in some ways.
Do you think that the obsession is the same for men on that same level, to be like the men that are shown in the magazines, those tall, thin men?
I think so, but also I think that there's more pressure for men to be muscular. And I think if you go into your average rack of magazines, there'll be the women's magazines that are aimed at telling women how to be thinner, how to be fitter, how to be basically everything, how to make themselves better in every way. It's very disheartening. But the men, there's a whole set of magazines around how men can be muscular, how they can be more fit, and that's, I think, where the pressure is going to be for men.
So do you think that might be why there's only, people who have eating disorders, out of all of those people, about 10% roughly they say that are males. So do you think that's why, statistics only show that 10%, because men are afraid to come out and admit that they have an eating disorder if they do, because they are surrounded by the pressure to, not be very, very thin, to be muscular?
I think so, but certainly the experience that I understood from men who did have what I would call traditional eating disorders, also it was very hard to find help. Programs were, rightfully so, designed for women, and it was hard to put a male into that. The male didn't feel comfortable, the women didn't feel comfortable, and so there wasn't I don't think that there's kind of an organized response. Even if men were to come forward with those things, it's a bit tricky to find a service that's suitable for them. I think also men are more likely to be doing things like taking steroids and exercising excessively to get another kind of ideal.
What would you say to the fact? I know I did some work for Eating Disorders of York Region, which is in Alberta, in Aurora, sorry, and I know that they have open co-ed sessions available to everyone, but they've only had I think a few men who actually do show up. But they do try to enforce a safe environment for both family, friends, and people who are coming in with the eating disorders. So, what do you think society can do to better inform men that these things do exist out there? It's more of like coming out of their shell to feel comfortable in that environment.
I don't know if there's anything I mean, I guess if any service is going to be targeting men, then they have to sort of have ways to communicate that outward in their promotional materials, in their program design. I mean, it's interesting. It'd be interesting to see, and I don't think we know this. Like, do co-ed sessions work? Like, does that actually work as a strategy? I'm sure nobody's even had a chance to study that yet because there hasn't been a significant enough volume of people, but it'd be interesting to hear sort of theorizing and writing about what kind of modality would work. Is it that? And then, if it is, to communicate that out effectively. Mm-hmm. I think it's very difficult when people are doing things like taking steroids. They do not, my experience of working with clients who are doing that, they're not really interested in not doing it. And my kind of expressions of concern to them often fall on pretty deaf ears.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, I called Telehealth Ontario a few weeks ago to talk to them about this issue, just curious to see if they had any research. And when I talked to the nurse on the phone, she said that she had no information to give me about males with eating disorders. And I know that there's limited amount of research, but for Telehealth Ontario, for a big organization that's supposed to be helping a large number of people, to have no research, that kind of shocked me. So I was just wondering if that also shocked you, hearing that.
It doesn't shock me, and I suspect that there may be information, but that this is a kind of at this point, a hidden problem. Like, it hasn't really come out of. It's a bit like things to do with sexual abuse for men. Like, it came much after kind of services and energy and political action and all those things around women and girls who had been sexually abused. It was later that issues for males came along, and I think this will be the same kind of thing. It'll take an agency offering a program and that getting some momentum behind it. It's probably going to be things like that conference that I presented at. There was some. I was on a panel with like a sports coach who was talking about body dysmorphic issues with athletes, and it's going to take things like that for it to get on the radar, on the radar, and then probably an agency to offer something, and then somebody like telehealth may hear.
Mm-hmm.